Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between. Welcome back to Old Man Rambles. Now, I don't know what happened. I must have looked sideways at the moon, something or other like that. But I'm getting why men over 50 have given up on women, why men over 50 are no longer dating, why men over 50 would rather die alone. These things are showing up all over my YouTube feed. Like I said, I must have glanced sideways at something the wrong way. But I got to talk about this. So I did kind of skim through a couple of these, mostly out of curiosity, but then they kept showing up. In the few that I've actually paid attention to, only one of them had any real validity. Because it acknowledged the problems that existed before. You know, a lot of these videos, like, things were so much better 50 years ago than they are today for men. Only one video acknowledged the problems that existed in traditional male relationships and expectations and things as they were 50 or some odd years ago. And that video is basically saying, you know, we've changed we've said that the expectations and things that we had for men 50 years ago aren't valid, but we haven't replaced them with anything. We've just said, yeah, that all sucked, and haven't given them any new, standards or ways to be a good man. That was valid, but the rest of them are all like complaining about women, complaining that men have done the math and they're no longer worth the cost. And one of the things I want to point out is that if you replace the word man with the word women, it works just as well, but you have to change the title to women over 30 instead of women over 50 because, women mature faster. Women basically figure out that relationships with men suck way quicker than men figure out that relationships with women suck. And even celebrities. I've seen, Gabriel Iglesias saying that, he no longer wants to be in relationships with women. He still wants to spend some time with them, but doesn't want to be in a relationship with them. And Taylor Tomlinson has a bit where, she listens to all her, female friends complaining about their boyfriends and going, have you heard the good news? You don't have to live like this. So there's all this back and forth about people complaining relationships suck. I'm going to focus on the male aspect of it because I'm a man. But I will acknowledge that, women are complaining about men not being worth the time just as much, if not more so. Relationships take work. They require compromise and, communication. I'll be the first person to admit that my marriage isn't perfect. My wife and I have been together, my wife and I started dating in 1988. So if you count that, we've been together almost 38 years, counting the dating aspect of it. That's a long time for anybody, and we've had arguments, we've had fights. We're not the best fit. My wife and I are very different people. I've made I've never hidden the fact that I'm a huge introvert. I'm very insular. Spend a lot of time wrapped up in my own head. I'm sure I've done plenty of things to aggravate my wife, many of which she's told me of. And my wife does things to aggravate me. We have different interests. We don't have a ton in common. The things that we do have in common, we try and share those things. But, I like video games and nerdy stuff. She doesn't like nerdy stuff, and she watches reality television, which I can't stand. She loves country music, which I'm not that fond of. I'm more irritated with the all-repeat radio station she listens to than the actual music itself. But yeah, we're not a perfect fit. And yes, we aggravate each other. But, when I get frustrated with my wife, when she's doing things that I think, irritate the hell out of me, even some of those things which are long-term and repetitive, I take a step back and realize I've done things too. I am not an innocent party in this relationship, which is one of the things I think all these men over 50 have given up on women videos miss. They're acting like the problem is entirely the women and are refusing to acknowledge or take any responsibility for any screw-ups these men may have done on their own. They're acting like it's all the women's fault. We've done the math and women aren't worth it. It's like, they did the math too, and you're not worth it either. This is a two-way street. And yeah, what aggravates me is, and yes, again, I'm mostly criticizing the men because those are the ones that are being fed to me, and as a man, that's my perspective. But it's this whole attitude that the fault is all on the women, and no accountability for their own failures as husbands or men. And I see plenty of it. I've done some of it myself. I'm not, like I said, I'm guilty of being an inattentive husband. I don't always show up for my wife when she perhaps needs me to be, because I spend all my time plugged into the screen. But, there are times my wife hasn't shown up for me either. It's a relationship. Any relationship has problems. My kids needed to stay here. They were having some work done on their house. They stayed here for a week. I loved it. I loved having my kids here. But does that mean there were no complications? They were here for a week with their 2 dogs. Their dogs are hyperactive and energetic. They can be cute. I love them, but they can also be irritating. Does that mean I didn't want them here? Of course not. I would love to have them here. I've told both of my kids they can move back in anytime they want. We may need to build an addition on the back of the house to make room for everybody, but yeah. But that would be complicated, and it would have complications, and it would have problems. Because when you live with someone, nothing goes right 100% of the time. There is another story I want to share, a personal story. As a young man, I moved to the big city of Portland, Maine, to live on my own for the first time. And a friend of mine from high school, who was taking a year off before he went to college, he was a year younger than me in high school. So, he's like, yeah, I'm not going to college yet. I'm going to move to Portland. We'll be roommates. It was great. It was a blast. He and I have far more in common than me and my wife do. We're both nerds. We both read nerdy books. We both read comic books and video games and sci-fi movies and stuff like that. And we had a blast. But a year and a half later, when he moved out, I hated his guts and never wanted to speak to him again. Things went sour, yada, 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 and they do. We eventually reconciled, and, he was the best man at my wedding, so on and so forth. But yeah, after a year and a half of living with this person, I would have been happy to never speak to him again. I could not stand him. But does that mean I shouldn't have friends anymore? Because I had an awful living experience with someone, does that mean, a friend, that I shouldn't make friends anymore? It's like, living with people is hard. And I know I did things to aggravate him too. Occasionally on purpose. You got to work at it. You have to be willing to step up, willing to admit your mistakes, willing to compromise. And I'm not saying if you have a bad relationship, you should stay in it. But take some damn accountability. Good hunting.